afternoon for our webinar, Network Benchmarks and Indicators. My name is Natalie Renew, and I am the Executive Director of Homegrown, and really excited to spend this time with you. If you would take a moment to tell us who you are and where you're joining us from by placing your name and organization and location in the chat. We'd love to hear about who you are and where you're joining us from today. I'm going to just introduce the amazing team that's joining us today and thank them for both their contributions to this project, but also for joining our conversation today. I am joined by my colleague, Karen Tylick, who is the Director of Program Operations at Homegrown. And we are collaborating with a team led by the Erikson Institute, including Juliet Bromer, who is a research professor in the Her Research Center, Marina Ranganese-Barnes, who's the research analyst at the Her Research Center, and Tony Porter, who is an independent consultant with Early Care and Education Consulting, and just want to state and share my great appreciation for their incredible work and for their partnership with Homegrown in this project. And then today we are also joined by Christy Smith, who is the Associate Director for the Home-Based Childcare Team in the Delaware Institute for Excellence in Early Childhood, and Sarah Michelson, the Director of Early Childhood Initiatives at the Harris County Office of the County Administration. So thank you again to these amazing speakers who all have the opportunity to hear from today. In terms of our agenda for our time today, we will spend a little bit of time looking at background on comprehensive networks and defining some terms. We will then look closely at network benchmarks and indicators, why we develop these indicators, an overview of the indicators, and talk about some use cases for these indicators. And then we'll hear from Christy as an example of the development of a network and how the indicators have supported the Delaware Institute for Excellence in Early Childhood in developing their home-based childcare network. We'll have a panel discussion with these members, and then have some time for Q&A and closing. And just to kind of offer a little bit of background to our conversation today, I wanted to share a little bit more about Homegrown. Homegrown is a home-based childcare, is a funders collaborative focused on improving quality and access to home-based childcare. Our mission is inclusive of supporting both licensed family childcare providers as well as licensed exempt and unregulated family, friend, and neighbor caregivers. And we are joined in this work by 16 national philanthropic organizations that support our work in advancing policy, practice, and systems improvement on behalf of home-based childcare providers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Karen, who will begin to dig into our work around networks and comprehensive networks.
Thanks, Natalie. So just very briefly, we wanted to start by addressing why we're focusing on networks in this work. So, of course, the idea of networks is not new. We all know that networks take many forms, from staffed family childcare networks to CCR&Rs, associations, unions, and that networks provide many important supports. But the pandemic really brought into sharp relief the need for comprehensive infrastructure. So we saw that during the pandemic, there was an increased demand for home-based childcare, but very limited supports for the caregivers and the providers. They faced financial hardship in terms of closures and increased cleaning costs. There was a lack of distinct and timely information that was specific to home-based providers. Information about who should remain open, who should close, and then limited access to some of the federal benefits and system supports, especially for our family, friend, and neighbor caregivers. So this really brought to the forefront a need for a comprehensive network strategy. And so Homegrown, in partnership with the Erikson Institute, has focused our efforts on a comprehensive network strategy. And that is the totality of what you're seeing in this graphic. Everything from the public policy and funding entity through the network hub in the middle that delivers the services, and crucially, the providers and the families. When we talk about a comprehensive network strategy, we are talking about durable infrastructure that uses a publicly funded network hub to offer services for providers, that allows providers to offer high quality programming, to be financially sustainable and to offer continuous care, to connect children, families, and providers to comprehensive services that support their mental, physical, and economic well-being, and to promote provider well-being as well. A comprehensive network strategy facilitates policy, payment, information, and support to home-based childcare providers, and it gathers and utilizes data. And we really want to emphasize that an essential component is that the comprehensive network strategy is informed by provider leadership and responsive to provider needs. It's not a top-down approach. There's also an emphasis on coherence with a vision for achieving key outcomes for providers, families, and children. So, with this concept of a comprehensive network strategy, we launched an initiative in 2021 called Building Comprehensive Networks. So we currently have 2 cohorts of state and local partners that are working to plan and implement their own comprehensive network strategies. In the planning phase, in partnership with Homegrown, sites receive a grant, participate in monthly learning communities, receive support from a Homegrown planning navigator, and have access to a number of open source resources from Homegrown and from our partners that are designed to guide sites through this process. They're then eligible for matching implementation grants upon approval of their plans. And as we collaborated with the states and local government partners who are really committed to building this infrastructure, it reinforced the need to articulate a clear vision for the services, the practices, and the supports of a high-quality comprehensive network. A more detailed vision of what networks can and should be to support providers and families. Essentially, we needed the benchmarks, which were still under development at that time. So in a few minutes, our Erikson partners are going to dig into the benchmarks. But first, I am happy to introduce Sarah Michelson, who is the Director of Early Childhood Initiatives of Harris County in Texas. Harris County is one of the partners in our first cohort of Building Comprehensive Networks. And Sarah is going to speak to their experience in launching this work, including why it's important and how the benchmarks can be supportive.
Great, thanks, Karen. I am so excited to be here. Harris County has been very fortunate to be a part of Building Comprehensive Networks. And for those of you that don't just know where Harris County, Texas is off the top of your head, our biggest city is Houston. We have several cities, but we're the 3rd largest county in the nation. I can't take credit for the good decision to be part of the Building Comprehensive Networks cohort. This is something that predates me. I have the fortunateness of being the first director of early childhood for the county. And in 2018, we elected a county judge, which is Texas's version of a county executive, who is very interested in supporting early childhood and early learning. And that sparked the county's very first investment in early learning in 2020. And since then, the county has really been dedicated to specifying resources with the aim of growing the availability of high quality childcare, especially for low income families and families of color across the county. Because of this interest, we participated in the network. And yes, just to give you a sense of why it's important for us to invest in childcare. Harris County is very large, as I said, 3rd largest. We have 4.7 million people, 300,000 and more than 300,000 of those people are children 5 and under. And we have over 2,500 regulated childcare providers, of which about 1,000 are home-based providers. And you can see that mismatch in numbers of providers and the number of kids we have. Certainly, we have a lot of family friend and neighbor care happening as well. So just wanted to highlight that the benchmarks have helped us, and being part of the Building Comprehensive Networks cohort has helped us in a lot of ways. And I'm excited for you to hear more about the benchmarks in more detail from my other colleagues. But I wanted to focus on a few of the areas that really informed our work here in Harris County as we were thinking about this. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just talk through those three things. So Harris County is a brand new player in the early childhood space. I'm sure you don't normally think of your county government. Maybe some of you are lucky to live in places where this isn't true, as super supportive of childcare providers within your region. And you're also a government entity. So I think those two things together, we realized we are probably not the brand and space to be able to really bring providers together kind of as Harris County. And in using the benchmarks, we were able to really hone in on a strategy. I think that resonated with our context and would resonate with providers and families locally in three different ways. So the benchmarks really helped us think about what's the right geographic level to situate networks for the unique context of a big place like Harris County, which is at times a lot like working in a state at the size of a state. We are larger than Rhode Island. We also have really used the benchmark areas around using provider voice to evaluate our strategy every step of the way in building it and really thinking about where provider voice comes in. And we've also really used it to think about how we design staffing and resource allocation for our network strategy, of which you see that very sophisticated graphic on the right of really building community-based hubs to support childcare, especially family-friendly neighbor and home-based childcare. And ultimately, the network strategy that we've ended up building, I think, is a lot more specific and sophisticated because we had the support of homegrown, but also the benchmarks allow you to start from somewhere and not from nowhere. So very, very glad you're here to learn about them today.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And so with that, we'd like to hand it off to our partners at Erikson. I think we'll be starting with Juliet Bromer. Juliet is a research professor at the Erikson Institute.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. So I'm going to just provide an overview of sort of building on where Karen started, an overview of definitions, so a little more about our rationale for developing the benchmarks and about our process. But then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Marina, who is going to really walk us through the specific benchmarks and some of the indicators. And then Tony is going to share some ways the benchmarks might be used in the field. And then you'll get to hear from Christy and Delaware of how they've been using the benchmarks. So first I'll start with some definitions. The term staffed family child care network was coined in a study that we did back in 2009 with 36 family child care networks in Chicago. And that study defined a staffed family child care network as a community-based organization with paid staff that offered a menu of ongoing services to licensed and regulated family child care providers. The study found that licensed family child care providers who were affiliated with a staffed family child care network offered higher quality care compared to family child care providers who had no affiliation with any type of organization. So 10 years later, Erikson Institute's 2019 National Study of Family Child Care Networks expanded this definition to identify some of the specific services and supports, including technical assistance and coaching, training, peer support, delivered again by a paid staff member to a targeted group of home-based childcare providers. And here's something new, it included both regulated family childcare and family friend and neighbor caregivers. So we really expanded the definition. We moved to calling it a home-based childcare network to suggest that broader umbrella of who might be served by a network. And we identified that study really sought to describe the landscape of networks at the time across the US. And we described many different kinds, as Karen alluded to, CCR&Rs, community-based organizations, standalone or dedicated family childcare networks. And so, so then fast forward to today, the current work being conducted by Homegrown through the Building Comprehensive Networks initiative really digs even deeper into this idea of a network and articulates for us different levels of networks, as Karen described. So under this comprehensive network strategy, this durable publicly funded infrastructure, are the HBCC networks themselves, which are broadly interconnected groups of providers and families who come together to enhance supports for home-based childcare with a focus on quality, access, and sustainability. And I think what's different, again, like our evolution in thinking and defining networks, is that a network could be something very formal, like an R&R or like a staffed family childcare network, but a network might also be something more informal, like a family childcare association. And so the sort of middle piece is the network hub that you saw in the graphic that Karen showed. The network hub really holds it all together and coordinates all the different entities in a county or a city or a state that are delivering supports to home-based childcare. So I think this multi-layered way of talking about networks and defining networks really helps move us forward as we're thinking about building networks and benchmarks. Next slide, please. So networks have been proposed and have actually been a strategy for supporting quality and home-based childcare for many years, as Karen noted. And yet, despite the policy attention and the proliferation of many different types of networks across the US, there really has not been a set of quality indicators for networks that could help government entities guide their investments and their strategies for building networks. So, like, you know, we've had there's some research, but there hasn't been a set of like, here's what a good high quality network looks like. So there hasn't been a lot of clear guidance around that. So the benchmarks are really meant to be a starting point for articulating high quality and equitable operations and service delivery for home-based childcare through networks. This project this project developing the benchmarks is really an iterative one. The benchmarks that we're going to present today are again a first step and are really a work in progress. And we'll be sharing our plans for next steps later in the webinar. Next slide. So let me just tell you a little bit about our process. We began by reviewing the very limited research on networks themselves, as well as some of the broader research on home-based childcare support. That review helped us identify some of the core areas for the benchmarks as a starting place. We then held a series of focus groups with providers who participate in networks and network staff and directors to really learn what was important to them, to learn some of their definitions, to really get their perspectives on what high quality service delivery means and looks like. Then we had multiple drafts. We had reviewers both at Homegrown and from other national organizations who gave us very detailed and thoughtful feedback. And then finally, we did an equity focused review of the benchmarks, since that was a focus that we really felt had not been as prominent in discussions about networks in the past. So now I'm going to turn it over to Marina, who will actually walk us through all the benchmarks and some of the indicators. Marina?
Okay, thank you, Juliet. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the benchmarks and indicators, as Juliet just said. So next slide, please. We developed a total of 11 benchmarks. These benchmarks are grouped into 3 broad categories: why, what, and how. The why benchmarks relate to a focus on home-based childcare, providers as equal partners, and a focus on equity. The what benchmarks deal with provider well-being, finances and sustainability, quality practices, and comprehensive services. And the how benchmarks relate to service delivery and implementation, data collection, staffing, and recruitment. I will go into detail about each of these benchmarks and their groupings in the following slides. But before we get into the benchmarks, I want to explain the structure of our benchmarks. So each of the 11 benchmarks articulates a broad principle of network quality. Each benchmark then includes a set of indicators that operationalize that principle. So these are specific features, practices, and approaches that might work together to achieve that broad principle of network quality articulated in the benchmark. The number of indicators under each benchmark vary, but there are anywhere between 3 and 8 indicators. And then finally, many indicators include examples of these features and practices. So I'm not going to share every single indicator today, but I will provide some examples to help describe the 11 benchmarks. So first we have the why benchmarks. The why benchmarks represent the fundamental values and goals of the network, or why a network does what it does. The first benchmark in this group is related to organizational culture focused on home-based childcare. This means that the organization has an intentional focus on home-based childcare as a distinct, essential, and valued early care and education setting for children and families. An example of an indicator under this benchmark is that the network articulates a commitment to home-based childcare as central to the organization's philosophy, approach, and operations. One way a network might do this is through their mission statement. The next benchmark describes providers as equal partners in network governance, decision-making, operations, and accountability. For example, one indicator under this benchmark is that the network supports and compensates providers as leaders through their engagement in distributed decision-making around governance and services design, as well as through co-creation of network operations. A network might do this by having a diverse provider leadership board or advisory group. They might include providers on the agency board of directors, or they might adopt clear and transparent agency policies about processes for provider input and governance. The final why benchmark is that the network demonstrates an intentional focus on equity and culturally grounded service delivery. An example of an indicator for this benchmark is that the network prioritizes groups of providers, families, and children who have been historically marginalized in order to increase their equitable access to meaningful and quality resources and opportunities. Other indicators relate to staff examining their own biases, the network understanding and respecting the diverse backgrounds of providers and families, and the network taking deliberate actions to support providers and families who have historically had inequitable access to these types of supports. Before we move on, I just want to note that provider voice and a focus on equity are articulated here in their own benchmarks. However, these benchmarks do not stand alone. They are interconnected, and these concepts are also incorporated throughout the other benchmarks and related indicators. Next, we have the what benchmarks. This group of benchmarks articulate network services that meet the goals for providers, children, and families in home-based childcare settings, or in other words, what the network does. The first benchmark relates to promoting provider well-being and attachment to home-based childcare work. This includes the provider's psychological and physical well-being, as well as their educational advancement and learning, and career and professional advancement. For an example, an indicator here is that the network nurtures provider psychological and physical well-being by reducing stress from difficult working conditions and helping improve work-life balance. Networks may do this by offering services related to self-care and stress reduction, hosting activities or events to reduce isolation, and offering or connecting providers to other resources. The next benchmark is that the network offers services that promote economic well-being and sustainability. One example here is that the network helps providers maintain full child enrollment to ensure steady and reliable income. Networks may do this by offering training, technical assistance, or peer support activities around marketing, having dedicated staff to help recruit and track enrollment, or maintaining a website with information about home-based childcare options to help families choose a provider. Other indicators under this benchmark also include facilitating providers' access to benefits, supporting providers' business operations, helping providers manage family expectations for care, offsetting costs of business through financial and material supports, and supporting provider navigation of federal, state, and local regulatory systems. The third benchmark relates to supporting quality. By this, we mean that the network offers services that build on and enhance culturally relevant and community-embedded provider practices that contribute to positive child and family outcomes. An example indicator under this benchmark is that the network builds on provider knowledge about working with children and families. Networks may do this in various ways, including through training, technical assistance, or peer support activities. Other indicators under this benchmark relate to health and safety practices, nurturing environments, provider-child interactions, planning formal and informal learning activities, and engaging families of children in care. The final benchmark in this group is that the network offers holistic services for children and families beyond the supports offered for providers. This would include knowing about the ways providers informally support families, keeping an up-to-date list of community resources and services, referring children and families as needed to resources, and following up with families to ensure that they were able to access those resources. An example indicator here is that the network refers children as needed to developmental, health and nutrition, and mental health screening and assessments, and mental health consultation. Lastly, we have the how benchmarks. These benchmarks reflect evidence-based implementation strategies used by networks. The first benchmark in this group is that the network uses research evidence to inform how services are implemented. This includes both a focus on relationship-based approaches to service delivery, as well as other logistical considerations. An example indicator here is that the network builds successful collaborations with providers and delivers supports to providers that acknowledge and build on provider strengths. The second benchmark relates to using data for improvement and evaluation. An example here is that the network collects meaningful data on network operations that are driven by the theory of change and provider voice. Other indicators under this benchmark relate to having a theory of change, having policies and procedures in place to ensure data security, analyzing data to examine implementation and aligned outcomes, and sharing findings with stakeholders. This might include providers, families, staff, or other external stakeholders. The third benchmark relates to using intentional staffing strategies. These indicators deal with hiring of staff, such as this example, recruits and hires program staff to specifically work with home-based childcare providers who bring an understanding and respect for home-based childcare. Other indicators relate to staff jobs, such as on-the-job training, staff supervision, setting boundaries, and wages, benefits, and career advancement. The final benchmark is about using recruitment strategies that result in ongoing provider participation. The rest of the benchmarks I have covered today mean nothing if providers are not engaging with the network. An example here is that the network collaborates with trusted community partners to reach out to home-based childcare providers. Now I'm going to pass it off to Tony, who will walk you through some tips and examples of how one might use the benchmarks.
Thanks, Marina. I'm not so sure whether this is going to be tips, but it's going to be some ideas of what you can use. And are we all overwhelmed yet by this document? Now you have an idea of why we developed the benchmarks and what the benchmarks are. And I'm going to talk about how you can use them. Next slide. Thank you. So how should networks approach using these benchmarks? As Marina indicated, The 11 benchmarks encompass 3 categories that relate to organizational culture, services for providers, children, and families, and strategies for implementation. These categories are interconnected. That is, the goals and values of a network form the foundation for the services that it offers and how it delivers these services. But what are the expectations for how to put these standards into practice? That's where the indicators come in, and there are lots of them. 57 in total, 10 for the 3 why benchmarks, 22 for the 4 what benchmarks, and 25 for the 4 how benchmarks. At first glance, this may seem overwhelming. How do we even approach this document? That depends on where your network is in its development. If you're in the early stages, working through how to incorporate provider voice and equity issues, the why, and thinking about the services you may want to offer, the what, you can use the indicators as a guide to develop your theory of change logic model to inform the long-term and intermediate outcomes that you want to achieve for providers, children, and families, and the implementation strategies you will use. This will mean taking a look at the 3 indicators for provider voice, benchmark B, and the 4 equity indicators in benchmark C, considering individual indicators that are related to benchmarks that articulate services that support provider well-being, quality, economic sustainability, and comprehensive services for families, benchmarks D through G, and turning to specific indicators for service delivery, relationship-based practice, staffing, and recruitment, for example. If you're an established network, you may want to focus on selected indicators that reflect your current interests and capacity. If, for example, you're aiming to enhance provider well-being and attachment to the HBCC workforce, you may want to consider whether you want to, or can support the indicator that relates to educational advancement and lifelong learning, facilitation of educational opportunities, as well as access to credentials or higher education degrees. Similarly, if your focus is on economic sustainability, you may want to think about whether you can, or want to meet the indicator about offering providers financial and material supports to offset their costs. You get what I mean. On the other hand, you may want to choose to address all of the benchmarks over time, beginning with a few that are easiest for you to meet and that make the most sense, and then moving on. Next slide, please. This is one of the questions that we anticipate you may all have, and the short answer is that it depends. It depends on what kind of network you are, based on Homegrown's definition. A comprehensive network strategy should be able to meet all of the benchmarks because it may work with one or more network hubs that collectively deliver all of the benchmark services, because it has a commitment to supporting home-based childcare and equity, a central strategy for inclusion of provider voice, and common data collection. For networks that operate outside of network hubs, meeting all of the benchmarks may be more challenging because they may not have the capacity to deliver the broad range of services that support providers, well-being, quality, economic sustainability, and comprehensive or holistic services. Next slide, please. So here are some concrete examples of how networks can use the benchmark. An existing home-based childcare network could use the benchmarks to review its mission and goals, plans for inclusion of provider voice, initial service offerings, and service implementation strategies to consider changes it may want to make and how it will make them. A government entity, local or state, county as in the case of Harris County, and Delaware as in the state as in the case of Delaware, that seeks to establish a comprehensive network strategy, or a community organization like some of the Family Child Care Association representatives that I see have registered here, or a provider group that seeks to establish a network hub or a home-based childcare network, can use the benchmarks to guide the development of all of these components. A state that seeks to develop a comprehensive network strategy could use the benchmarks to identify criteria for funding a new network hub or a new network, including mechanisms for accountability, such as documentation and evaluation results. A state with existing home-based childcare networks or network hubs could use the benchmarks for similar purposes. An organization that supports that supports home-based childcare network development, such as Homegrown, could use the benchmarks to assess the network landscape, to document the variation among HBCC networks, network hubs, and comprehensive network strategies, and to identify potential needs for additional technical assistance and support, as well as future questions for research. Now I'm going to turn this over to Christy Smith, who's going to share Delaware's experience with the benchmarks.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, sharing about the exciting work of Family Child Care Networks. I was actually planning to be on the other side of this, watching these amazing people, but they asked me to share Delaware's story. So here I go. The Delaware Institute for Excellence in Early Childhood, or DIEEC, is housed within the Human Development and Family Sciences Department at the University of Delaware. At the DIEEC, we work to improve the lives of young children and their families through a variety of services that we offer to the early childhood community. The state of Delaware contracts with us to support various early childhood initiatives within the state, and one of these initiatives is Family Child Care Networks. Our staff at the DIEEC is partnering with the Erikson Institute to evaluate our work. And I just wanted to share a picture. Pictured here is our Delaware pilot network. This is the group from Sussex County. They came together a few months ago and have been meeting regularly. Their current work is really all about orienting to the child care management system, Brightwheel, which I'm going to talk about that whole process in a few more minutes. Next slide. So this graphic was created in collaboration with the Erikson Institute, and it kind of mirrors the graphic that you saw, Homegrown's graphic that you saw a few slides back. And we wanted to create something like this to help the community better understand how and why we're starting this work. DIEEC works with providers to decide on supports in the areas of quality, business and sustainability, and holistic services, so that we can support providers to participate in publicly funded systems. Our work in Delaware came from two main needs. First, we wanted to support family child care educators to participate in existing publicly funded programs. In Delaware, we have publicly funded programs that family providers are allowed to participate in. However, there are no family child care educators currently participating in them. So we wanted to support them to be able to do so. Second, this work will provide us, we're hoping, with valuable information about what family child care providers need to participate in publicly funded systems. Our hope is that through this work, we will be able to develop an understanding of what providers need and how we can best support them to build a statewide system of support for all family child care providers who desire to participate in publicly funded systems. Next slide. And so how are we actually using the benchmark? So I pulled out a few examples of how we've used them in Delaware. So beginning with the benchmark focus on home-based childcare, one of those indicators, indicator A2, states promotes inclusion of home-based childcare in public ECE systems and initiatives as an equity issue. So as I shared earlier, Delaware started this work because we saw a need to support family child care educators and being able to participate in publicly funded systems. Family child care is an essential piece of the ECE landscape, and many family child care providers are suffering without adequate support to take part in initiatives that could increase their income and keep them in the field. So through networks, we're supporting providers to participate while strengthening systems in Delaware that will support all providers. And then more generally, the DIEEC has reorganized to create a team devoted to supporting home-based childcare providers. We have dedicated staff who focus on quality improvement and the development and delivery of professional development experiences, specifically for home-based providers. Moving on, the benchmark providers as partners has probably been the most important piece of our work so far. It's really important to our work that we collaborate with the network providers to make decisions that will be most supportive for them. So there's two indicators that I wanted to touch on in this benchmark area. Indicator B1 offers scaffolding, transparency, preparation, training, and support for providers to meaningfully engage and share power as decision-making partners at the network. An example of how we've incorporated this idea is the process that we use to select Brightwheel, the childcare management system for the networks. Over the course of several weeks, we researched various systems and identified several different vendors to share with the network providers. We scheduled demonstrations with these vendors and asked the network providers to vote on the childcare management system that they wanted to use as part of the network. And now we're engaged in orientation with the selected company to ensure that our staff and the network providers have adequate training on using the system so it can be most useful for their programs. And then the second indicator that I wanted to touch on in providers as partners was B2, supports and compensates providers as leaders through their engagement in distributed decision-making around governance and services design, as well as through co-creation of network operations. So an example of how we've worked to support and compensate providers as leaders is our work with family childcare ambassadors. Currently, we have 3 family childcare ambassadors who we meet with on a monthly basis, at least. I think more informally, it's probably on a daily basis, but we meet with them to plan and discuss future ideas for the networks. Our ambassadors have a scope of work that frames their collaboration with us, and they're compensated for the work that they do to support DIEEC. Our ambassadors have been essential in recruiting providers to join the networks, which leads me to the final benchmark that I wanted to share about right now, which is recruitment. And the indicator that I wanted to kind of talk about was K2, tailors recruitment strategies that are culturally and linguistically responsive to the ways providers may access information and that incorporate different messages for FCC and FFN providers. So at this point in time, our focus is on licensed providers. More often than not, licensed providers, and frankly, FFN probably as well, have a lot of thoughts when it comes to partnering with organizations or adding something else to their overflowing plate. Having another FCC provider to share and talk with their colleagues about how partnering with us can be helpful really does a lot to help us build bridges with providers. Our ambassadors have developed individual plans with our network staff to identify the best ways to recruit providers in their areas. A lot of times a personal phone call from another provider really just makes all the difference. And so really having a good understanding of what providers in different areas will need and having our ambassadors to be able to support that work has really, really helped us to be successful in the area of recruitment. That wraps up what I had planned to share. And I think Karen has some questions for the panel.
Great. Thank you, Christy. It's really wonderful to hear about your work and about how the benchmarks are supporting you and all the great work that you're doing. At this point, we're going to shift over to a panel discussion, and we have a few questions. I'd like to start with a question for Marina about the development of the benchmarks. So Marina, if you could give us a brief overview of how you balanced input from the field with the existing body of research on networks in developing the benchmarks.
Yes, thank you. So Juliet already described our really iterative process for developing the benchmarks and indicators, so I won't go over all that again. But what we found is that the research on networks is pretty limited. So the representatives from the field participated in our feedback process. We're really able to not only validate some of the things we found in the research, but more importantly, we're able to fill in the gaps from the research. Sometimes there are accepted best practices and promising emergency practices that haven't been studied yet or aren't described in the research. And because this is a working document, we wanted to be able to make sure to capture all of that. The research evidence primarily focused on services that networks offer, while the stakeholders tended to focus more on the concepts related to why and how networks operate, like relationship-based support, equity, and provider voice, which may be a little more difficult to study or something that researchers haven't focused on as much as it relates to networks in the past.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marina. Next, I'd like to ask Sarah. Sarah, if you don't mind reflecting on which aspects of the benchmarks and indicators would have been most helpful for you as you began this work, and what challenges do you see the benchmarks helping folks address, overcome, or avoid if they were to similarly start working on their own comprehensive network strategy?
Yeah, happy to answer that, Karen. I think for us, when we were starting out on our journey of designing a network, and as the first cohort didn't have the benchmarks didn't exist yet, so there are a few ways that now that they do exist, they've been super helpful. So one, I would say, I don't know how many of you are in the same position as me, where you're maybe one early childhood person amongst a bunch of non-early childhood people who make decisions for what you select and fund. And although in early childhood networks and shared services and all these concepts, I think are things that we've known about for a long time and have been talking about, they seem very esoteric to other people when you start to describe them. And so I think the benchmarks have helped us in a few ways. One, just like there is a field of study, and this is an existing strategy that has been implemented in a number of places, but it also gives you something concrete to hang on to, and to show that there is a why and a how to all of this. And because on the flip side, I think also coming in, it also helped us be less narrow in our view of what a network could achieve. So I think you may have a specific goal in mind, like we really need a substitute pool. And I think this helps you elevate up in that conversation to figure out how you structure something and how you may get to the right kind of what's for your particular community, whether that's you and 5 other home-based providers getting together, or whether you're like me in a big government entity trying to figure this out. So, I mean, I think that anyone who started a strategy from scratch knows how much brain power and time it really takes. And I think that I would just recommend people to remember this is a very helpful tool that you don't have to kind of start from scratch or even start from a specific program somewhere. This really, this team has done that for you and really elevated up to a framework that's really helpful for you to start from.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Christy, I'd love to ask you, sort of building on that idea of where to start. We know that there is a lot in the benchmarks and that at first glance, it could be a little overwhelming. So I wanted to ask if you had any recommendations for networks or government entities that are beginning this work and don't know where to start with the benchmarks.
Sure. I can definitely do that because it was very overwhelming when when Erikson shared the benchmarks with us. I would say start small, read them, get to know them, prioritize where you want to start, and just start there and just regularly review them so that you can kind of, when you are ready to take a next step, you can use the benchmarks to guide your work. So really just start small, and any little piece you can implement, or start thinking about how you want to implement even, I think is beneficial. But don't put them away and don't look at them.
Great, thanks so much. And then Juliet, I was hoping you would share with us what are the next steps around the benchmarks and what are some options if folks wanted to offer feedback.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Karen. So as I mentioned, and well, as we've all sort of emphasized, this is a start, right? This is a tool that we hope people will use, but we really need, we need more research. We need to learn more about, are these the right, benchmarks? How do they work? And so I know there was a question, I think in the Q&A from Tracy about, thinking about integrating them into QRIS. And there was another question about QRIS. And I think, we really think it's much too early to be thinking about any kind of high stakes structure that we connect to the benchmarks. We really see them, the use cases that Tony talked about and that Christy and Sarah have shared with us are really how we think is where we want to start with the benchmarks, right? We want to understand, how are people using them? Are they useful? What kind of changes, innovations are they leading to? And actually, we will be with Homegrown, the Erikson team with Homegrown will be fielding a survey of existing networks across the country later this fall, based on the benchmarks, so that we can sort of get an understanding of like the state of the field and are these things actually happening out there? To what extent? Where might we see areas where maybe there needs to be more discussion, more technical assistance, more investment? What areas seem to be kind of really going well? So I think it's really, really down the road before we can start thinking about, how states would use these in a more high stakes way. And I really, I think more that we hope that these will guide development of networks, will guide, like, what are the important things, especially those why benchmarks? What do you want to be thinking of if you're coming together to use public dollars to fund supports for home-based childcare? So look out for the survey, because that will be coming to networks, and we hope you'll participate and help us learn more. But more immediately, we've developed a very short form that I think someone's going to drop in the chat, where you could just tell us like questions you have about the networks, but also as you start to dig in, come back to the form, tell us how you're using the networks, the benchmarks. Tell us what was useful or what was not useful and what was confusing. So we really want to, we see this as an iterative process with all of you. And so we're eager for your feedback over the next, bit of time. So those are some next steps.
Great. Thanks so much, Juliet. We absolutely want to hear from everyone. So please do reach out, whether it's through the form or out to us directly. So I think we've answered some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A, but Natalie, I wanted to see if there were any others that we needed to address before we wrap things up.
Sure. I'd like to give this question to Sarah or Christy, which is around advice on securing sustainable funding for childcare networks. I think implicit and explicit is our belief that to do this well and to embed networks as infrastructure that's there in good times and in bad, today and tomorrow and forever, that public funding is a really key part of this. So I wonder, Sarah or Christy, if either of you would want to comment on how nonprofit and community-based partners might work with government to develop these networks.
Can say some really quick words and then I'll pass it to you, Christy. So I think it's really important, and I do think the benchmarks help to show that networks aren't kind of a strategy unto themselves. They are interconnected with different strategies. As someone who has worked in government, most of my non-classroom career, I would say I think that's really important for selling to public partners. I can't really speak totally to private partners, maybe where you're at, but I do think that would help as well. We've been talking about ours really as a quality improvement effort and making people see that it is really about a different way to build quality and a more generative kind of community-based way to build quality, not just kind of selling it as a network itself. And that's helped us. So that may help in your context.
Yeah, so I would kind of piggyback off of what Sarah said. We work with our state. They contract with us to provide all of the quality improvement and professional development services to the ECA community. So we have a great relationship with them. And so the network, is a separate contract for us, at least for the time being, but we, shared it as a strategy to support the initiatives that we were already partnering with them on. So a strategy to support family child care provider improvement and professional development. So, we started small with a very short time period, just get a little bit of the work done, and we're slowly growing it. So I think that is also a way to start, is to kind of start small, show them what can happen so that you're able to acquire more funding to scale it up.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give the last question to Tony and try to combine Gladys's question and Terry's question. For a group that wants to use these benchmarks in their evaluation activities, how might they think about the networks to kind of assess, performance and evaluation? And if you want to say a couple words about the evaluation toolkit, that would be great.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Natalie. And I saw those questions and they're good ones. And so, the very first thing I think you'd want to do, and you're already aware of this, is look at the why benchmarks and the how benchmarks before you get to the services ones, the what's, because those are the ones you're closest to and kind of the best. And in the how benchmarks, you're going to see a theory, an indicator that relates to a theory of change model that's going to encompass all of these things, your strategies, your recruitment, and everything else. And so just like with any other evaluation, you want to figure out what your primary evaluation questions are. What do you care about here? Do you care about whether this worked for providers in the sense that they feel that they're included? Do you care that you achieved some intermediate outcomes? Do you care whether you improved your data collection system the way you wanted to? So you want to think long and hard about your questions, and then your evaluation flows from there. If you're concerned about the kind of outcomes that you've achieved, you may want to use Homegrown's toolkit, which has a variety of different tools, instruments, data collection things in it that can help you identify the answers to your questions. So there are a range of tools in there that extend from how to collect data about the types and numbers of providers you serve, how to collect data about the kinds of services you offer, even the outcomes that you may want to achieve, and that might be a very valuable tool for you. We can provide more answers if you want some specifics.
Great. Thanks, Tony. We're just about out of time. I wanted to share a couple of final resources. We've posted in the chat the report that includes the benchmarks. There's also a complimentary research brief that really describes in greater detail the research underpinnings that Marina spoke about, during the presentation, and also really encourage you to share your feedback in the forum. We really want to know what worked, what didn't work, what questions are outstanding, and how we can support developing out this concept and the networks that are involved. We will follow up and share a recording of this event, as well as the materials that are included here. And it looks like there's an interest in contacting presenters, so we will also include additional contact information. I want to just say a huge thank you to our presenters, and a special thank you to the team at Erikson for their incredibly hard work, the team at Erikson and Tony for their incredible hard work in pulling this all together, and for the many stakeholders, many of whom are on the call, who contributed to the work. Thank you all for spending this time with us, and we will follow up with a follow-up email with these resources and additional follow-up items. Have a great rest of your day.